They came seeking the American dream, carrying nothing but hope and determination across vast oceans and foreign borders. Yet some would leave behind a legacy written not in success stories, but in blood. Today we examine 4 chilling cases where newcomers to American soil committed acts so heinous they would haunt entire communities for generations. In the summer of 1952, the small industrial town of Millfield, Pennsylvania, had never seen anything quite like Dmitry Volkov. The broad-shouldered Russian immigrant had arrived just 18 months earlier, speaking broken English but possessing an extraordinary talent for metalwork that quickly earned him employment at the local steel foundry. His landlord, Mrs. Dorothy Henshaw, would later describe him as quiet, punctual with rent, and seemingly devoted to his work. She noticed he kept odd hours, often hearing his heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs well past midnight, but attributed this to the demanding shift schedules at the plant. What Mrs. Henshaw didn't know was that Dmitry had developed an obsession with the Carmichael family, who lived 3 blocks away on Elm Street. Harold Carmichael owned the town's only hardware store and lived there with his wife Margaret and their twin daughters, both 14 years old. Dmitry had first encountered the family during a routine visit to purchase supplies, and something about their apparent contentment had triggered a dark fascination within him. For weeks, Dmitry began timing his walks to coincide with the family's daily routines. He knew that Harold left for the store at precisely 7:45 each morning, that Margaret tended her prized rose garden every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, and that the twins, Sarah and Susan, walked home from school together every day at 3:15, always stopping at Patterson's candy shop on Main Street. On the evening of August 14th, 1952, the Carmichael household settled into their usual Wednesday routine. Harold was reading the evening paper in his favorite armchair, Margaret was mending clothes by the window, and the twins were upstairs completing their summer reading assignments. The windows were open to catch any hint of a breeze on that sweltering night, and the sounds of the neighborhood drifted in peacefully. It was just after 10 o'clock when Dmitry climbed through the kitchen window. He had been watching the house for over an hour, waiting for the last light to go out. His massive hands, calloused from years of working with molten metal, now gripped a hammer he had taken from his toolbox. The house was dark except for a small lamp in the living room where Harold had dozed off in his chair. Margaret heard the first scream from upstairs and rushed toward the sound, but she never reached the staircase. Harold awakened to find a shadowy figure standing over him, and his last conscious thought was confusion rather than fear. The twins had no chance to understand what was happening before their lives were brutally ended in their shared bedroom. When Harold failed to open his store the next morning, concerned neighbors began to worry. Mrs. Patterson from the candy shop was the first to notice that the twins hadn't appeared for their usual afternoon visit. By evening, Harold's business partner decided to check on the family. What he discovered when he peered through the kitchen window would haunt him for the rest of his life. The entire Carmichael family had been murdered with savage precision. The police determined that the killer had moved methodically through the house, ensuring that no one could escape or call for help. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, which immediately ruled out robbery as a motive. The weapon, a common carpenter's hammer, was found carefully cleaned and placed on the kitchen counter, suggesting the killer had taken time after the murders to compose himself. Detective Frank Morrison, who had been with the Pennsylvania State Police for 15 years, had never encountered such a calculated act of violence. The killer had left behind no fingerprints, no footprints in the soft earth beneath the kitchen window, and no witnesses. It seemed almost impossible that someone could commit such an elaborate crime and vanish without a trace. The investigation initially focused on the family's known associates and business relationships. Harold Carmichael had no enemies that anyone could identify, and the family was well liked throughout the community. Margaret sang in the church choir, the twins were honor students, and Harold had never had so much as an argument with his customers or competitors. It was only when Detective Morrison began interviewing people who lived near the Carmichael house that a pattern began to emerge. Several neighbors mentioned seeing a large man walking past the house on multiple occasions, always at different times, but always moving slowly, as if studying the property. Mrs. Eleanor Voss, who lived directly across the street, provided the most detailed description. She had noticed the man because of his distinctive gait and his habit of pausing at the corner to light cigarettes. The breakthrough came when Morrison realized that the timing of these sightings corresponded with shift changes at the steel foundry. A quick check of employee records revealed that Dmitry Volkov lived within walking distance of Elm Street and worked shifts that would have allowed him to be in the neighborhood at the times witnesses had reported seeing the mysterious figure. When police arrived at Mrs. Henshaw's boarding house to question Dmitry, they found his room meticulously clean and completely empty. His few possessions were gone, and according to his landlord, he had paid through the end of the month and left sometime during the night without explanation. The foreman at the steel foundry confirmed that Dmitry had failed to report for his shift that morning and had not called in sick. A manhunt was launched immediately, but Dmitry Volkov had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. His immigration records led nowhere, and attempts to trace his background in Russia proved futile. Some speculated that he had assumed a false identity upon entering the country, while others believed he had fled back to Europe. Railroad personnel at the nearest station remembered selling a ticket to a large man, matching Dmitry's description, but he had paid cash and provided no identification. The Carmichael murders sent shockwaves through communities across Pennsylvania and beyond. The idea that a stranger could observe a family for weeks, learn their routines, and then eliminate them with such cold precision was deeply disturbing to Americans who prided themselves on their welcoming attitude toward immigrants. For the first time, many small towns began to view newcomers with suspicion rather than sympathy. Dmitry Volkov was never found, and the case remains officially unsolved. Detective Morrison would later say that in 30 years of police work, he had never encountered a criminal who combined such meticulous planning with such brutal execution. The Carmichael case became a cautionary tale that spread far beyond Millfield, contributing to a growing anxiety about the backgrounds and intentions of those seeking refuge in America. Our second case takes us to the sun-baked landscape of Arizona in the spring of 1961, where the small desert town of Copper Ridge was experiencing unprecedented growth due to a nearby mining operation. Among the flood of job seekers and fortune hunters who arrived that year was a soft-spoken man named Carlos Mendoza, who claimed to have come from a village in central Mexico where drought had destroyed his family's farming operation. Carlos was different from the typical migrants who passed through Copper Ridge. He was educated, well-dressed, and spoke English with only a slight accent. He rented a small apartment above Kowalski's general store and quickly found work as a bookkeeper for the mining company. His employer, Thomas Burke, was impressed by Carlos's attention to detail and his ability to solve complex accounting problems that had puzzled previous employees. What made Carlos particularly welcome in Copper Ridge was his apparent devotion to helping other Mexican immigrants navigate the complicated process of finding work and housing. He served as an unofficial translator and mediator, helping families fill out paperwork and negotiate with landlords who spoke no Spanish. The local Catholic priest, Father Miguel Santos, praised Carlos as a godsend for the growing immigrant community. But Carlos Mendoza harbored secrets that would soon manifest in the most horrific way imaginable. He had not fled Mexico because of drought, but because he had been suspected in the disappearance of 3 young women in his hometown. Mexican authorities had never gathered enough evidence to arrest him, but local residents had grown increasingly suspicious of his behavior around unmarried women. In Copper Ridge, Carlos began to display the same predatory patterns that had aroused suspicion in Mexico. He showed unusual interest in young women who worked as domestics or in the few businesses that employed female staff. He would offer to help them with translation services or job searches, always presenting himself as a benevolent older brother figure who wanted to protect them from exploitation. Rosa Delgado was 19 years old when she caught Carlos's attention in late May of 1961. She had arrived in Copper Ridge with her younger brother Eduardo, hoping to earn enough money cleaning houses to bring their parents north from Sonora. Rosa was careful and intelligent, but she was also trusting of a fellow Mexican who seemed genuinely interested in helping her succeed in a foreign country. Carlos began by offering Rosa advice about which employers were most reliable and fair in their treatment of domestic workers. He helped her negotiate better wages and provided her with basic English lessons that she needed to communicate with her clients. Rosa was grateful for his assistance and came to regard him as a protective figure in a town where few people shared her language or understood her struggles. It was Carlos who suggested that Rosa might earn more money by cleaning houses in the wealthy section of Copper Ridge, where mining executives and other prosperous residents lived in large homes that required extensive maintenance. He offered to introduce her to potential clients and even volunteered to escort her to interviews to ensure she wasn't taken advantage of by unscrupulous employers. On the afternoon of June 10th, Carlos picked up Rosa in his battered pickup truck for what he said would be an interview with a mining executive's wife who needed help preparing for a large dinner party. Rosa was excited about the opportunity because Carlos had told her the job would pay more than twice her usual rate. She had even purchased a new dress for the interview, using money she had been saving to send to her parents. Rosa's brother Eduardo became concerned when she failed to return home that evening. He knew she had planned to be back by 6 o'clock to help him prepare dinner. When she hadn't appeared by 8, he walked to Carlos's apartment to inquire about the interview. Mrs. Kowalski, who lived downstairs from Carlos, told Eduardo that she had seen Carlos return home around 4:30, but she had not seen Rosa with him. Carlos appeared genuinely surprised and concerned when Eduardo knocked on his door. He explained that the interview had been postponed at the last minute, and he had dropped Rosa at the bus station so she could visit a friend in Phoenix who had written her about job opportunities there. He seemed confident that she would return in a few days with good news about better employment prospects. Eduardo found this explanation troubling because Rosa had never mentioned having friends in Phoenix, and she would never have left town without telling him or taking any of her belongings. When Carlos couldn't provide the name of Rosa's supposed friend or explain why she hadn't taken even a change of clothes, Eduardo decided to contact the local sheriff. Sheriff Bob Garrison had dealt with numerous missing person cases involving migrant workers who often moved from town to town following work opportunities. Initially, he was inclined to accept Carlos's explanation, especially since Carlos had such a strong reputation in the community as a helper and advocate for immigrant families. However, Eduardo's insistence that Rosa would never have left without telling him prompted Garrison to investigate further. The breakthrough in the case came when Garrison decided to search the desert area, where Carlos claimed to have dropped Rosa at a remote bus stop. There was no official bus stop in the location Carlos had described, and a search of the surrounding area revealed disturbing evidence. Rosa's new dress was found buried under a pile of rocks about half a mile from the supposed drop-off point, and nearby, investigators discovered other personal items that clearly belonged to her. When confronted with this evidence, Carlos maintained his innocence and suggested that Rosa had been attacked by bandits or wild animals after he had left her at what he thought was a safe location. His story began to unravel when investigators learned that there was no bus service to Phoenix from the remote area he had described, and no one at the legitimate bus station in Copper Ridge remembered seeing Rosa or Carlos that day. A more thorough search of the desert revealed Rosa's remains, and the medical examiner determined that she had been murdered. The evidence suggested that she had been killed shortly after leaving town with Carlos, and her body had been carefully concealed in a location that might never have been discovered if not for Eduardo's persistence in demanding an investigation. Carlos Mendoza was arrested and charged with murder, but during the trial, prosecutors uncovered evidence that suggested Rosa might not have been his only victim. Witnesses came forward to report that other young women had disappeared after being seen in Carlos's company, both in Copper Ridge and in other towns where he had lived previously. However, without bodies or additional physical evidence, prosecutors could only pursue charges related to Rosa's death. The trial revealed that Carlos had used his position as a trusted community member to identify and isolate vulnerable victims. His offer to help with job searches and interviews provided him with opportunities to get women alone in remote locations where they could be attacked without witnesses. The prosecution argued that Carlos had refined his methods over several years and had probably killed multiple victims before settling in Copper Ridge. Carlos Mendoza was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case traumatized the immigrant community in Copper Ridge, where families realized that their trust in a fellow countryman had enabled a predator to operate freely among them. Many residents left town after the trial, unable to cope with the knowledge that they had welcomed a killer into their midst. The Mendoza case highlighted the vulnerability of immigrant communities and the ways in which predators could exploit the trust and solidarity that typically characterized these tight-knit groups. It also demonstrated how difficult it could be for law enforcement to investigate crimes involving transient populations who often had limited contact with official institutions. Our third case transports us to the bustling metropolis of Chicago in the winter of 1968, a city already struggling with social unrest and economic uncertainty. Among the thousands of new residents arriving each month was an unassuming man named Klaus Weber, who had immigrated from Germany and quickly found employment as a maintenance worker in one of the city's largest apartment complexes. Klaus was a model employee and tenant who kept to himself, but always greeted neighbors politely and maintained his small efficiency apartment in spotless condition. Building superintendent Frank O'Malley would later describe Klaus as the most reliable and conscientious worker he had ever employed, someone who took pride in keeping the building's common areas clean and the mechanical systems running smoothly. What residents of the Riverside Towers apartment complex didn't know was that Klaus Weber had been quietly conducting a campaign of psychological terrorism against selected tenants for months before anyone realized what was happening. His position as maintenance worker gave him access to every apartment in the building, and he had been using this privilege to engage in increasingly elaborate acts of intimidation and surveillance. Klaus had developed an obsession with what he perceived as the moral decay of American society, particularly the behavior of young unmarried couples who lived together without benefit of marriage. He had identified several such couples in the building and had appointed himself as their judge and tormentor, believing that he was carrying out a righteous mission to punish immorality. His first targets were Janet Morrison and David Chen, a young interracial couple who had moved into apartment 4B in September of 1968. Klaus found their relationship particularly offensive, not only because they were unmarried, but because he harbored deep-seated racist beliefs that made their union seem especially objectionable to him. He began his campaign against them with subtle acts of sabotage and harassment. Janet and David initially attributed the strange occurrences in their apartment to the building's age and poor maintenance. Their hot water would shut off without warning, lights would flicker mysteriously, and they frequently found their apartment door slightly ajar when they returned from work, though nothing ever appeared to be missing. Klaus was careful to make these incidents seem like random mechanical failures rather than deliberate sabotage. As weeks passed, the harassment escalated. Janet began finding disturbing notes slipped under their door, written in broken English and condemning their lifestyle choices in religious terms. The notes were unsigned and contained biblical quotations about sin and punishment. David wanted to report the harassment to building management, but Janet worried that complaining might result in their eviction if the landlord shared Klaus's disapproval of their relationship. Klaus's psychological torment reached new levels of sophistication as he learned more about Janet and David's schedules and personal habits. He would rearrange furniture in their apartment while they were at work, always making changes subtle enough that they might initially doubt their own memories. He would tamper with their food, adding salt to coffee or sugar to soup, creating a constant sense of unease and confusion. The situation became genuinely frightening when Klaus began leaving evidence that he had been watching them during their most intimate moments. Janet would find her undergarments rearranged in specific patterns, and David discovered that someone had been taking photographs through their bedroom window. The couple finally realized they were dealing with a stalker rather than random bad luck or building maintenance issues. On the evening of February 14th, 1969, Klaus decided that his campaign of harassment had not been sufficient to drive Janet and David from the building or to end their relationship. He had concluded that more direct action was necessary to punish what he saw as their persistent defiance of moral law. Armed with a kitchen knife and a container of gasoline, he used his master key to enter their apartment while they were sleeping. Klaus's plan was to force the couple to confess their sins and beg for forgiveness before he killed them, but he had underestimated David's willingness to fight back. When Klaus entered their bedroom and turned on the lights, David immediately understood the deadly nature of the threat and fought desperately to protect himself and Janet. The struggle was brief but violent, and Klaus's superior size and preparation gave him a decisive advantage. Janet managed to escape from the bedroom and run toward the apartment door, but Klaus caught her in the hallway and stabbed her repeatedly before she could call for help. David's efforts to intervene ended when Klaus turned the knife on him with savage efficiency. The entire attack lasted less than 5 minutes, and Klaus was careful to lock the apartment door behind him when he left, buying himself additional time before the bodies would be discovered. Klaus returned to his own apartment and spent the next several hours cleaning himself and disposing of evidence. He had planned his escape carefully, having already purchased a bus ticket to Detroit under an assumed name. By the time other tenants discovered the bodies the following morning, Klaus had vanished from Chicago, leaving behind only a neatly organized apartment and a resignation letter that gave no hint of his true reasons for leaving. The investigation into the murders initially focused on David's co-workers and Janet's ex-boyfriends, as police assumed the killer must have had some personal relationship with the victims. It was only when detectives began interviewing other tenants about building security that they learned about the harassment campaign that had been directed at Janet and David. Several neighbors admitted they had heard arguments and sounds of struggle from apartment 4B, but they had assumed it was domestic violence and had been reluctant to get involved. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered Klaus's apartment and found a detailed journal documenting his surveillance of multiple tenants and his elaborate plans for punishing those whose behavior he found objectionable. The journal revealed that Janet and David had not been his only targets, and that he had been planning attacks on several other couples in the building. A nationwide manhunt for Klaus Weber proved futile, as he had apparently prepared multiple false identities and had access to cash reserves that allowed him to disappear completely. Some investigators believed he had fled to Canada or Mexico, while others suspected he had assumed a new identity and was living somewhere in the United States, possibly continuing his pattern of targeting unmarried couples. The Weber case exposed significant flaws in apartment building security and raised troubling questions about the background checks performed on maintenance workers who had access to residents' homes. Building owners throughout Chicago began implementing new security measures, but the damage to public confidence had already been done. Many tenants became suspicious of maintenance workers and other building employees, creating an atmosphere of distrust that persisted for years. The murders also highlighted the vulnerability of young couples who lived together outside the bounds of traditional marriage, a lifestyle choice that was becoming increasingly common but remained controversial in many communities. Janet Morrison and David Chen became symbols of a changing social order that some Americans found threatening and their deaths were seen by some as evidence of the dangers inherent in abandoning traditional values. Our final case brings us to the coastal city of Portland, Maine, in the autumn of 1975, where the fishing and shipping industries were attracting workers from around the world. Among those seeking employment was a quiet Scandinavian man named Erik Lindqvist, who claimed to have experience in commercial fishing and quickly found work aboard the trawler Northern Star. Erik was an exemplary crew member who worked long hours without complaint and demonstrated remarkable skill in handling the dangerous equipment used in deep-sea fishing. Captain Robert McAllister was so impressed with Erik's performance that he recommended him for a position on the Atlantic Dawn, a larger vessel that offered better pay and more stable employment. Erik seemed grateful for the opportunity and quickly established himself as one of the most reliable and hard-working fishermen in the Portland fleet. What his fellow crew members didn't know was that Erik Lindqvist was not his real name, and his experience with boats came not from commercial fishing, but from a much darker background. He had fled Norway after being suspected in a series of disappearances involving young women who had been taken from coastal villages during the night. Norwegian authorities had never gathered sufficient evidence to arrest him, but local residents had grown suspicious of his nocturnal wanderings and his intimate knowledge of secluded areas along the coastline. In Portland, Erik began to exhibit the same predatory behavior that had made him a suspect in Norway. He would spend his shore leave walking through residential neighborhoods near the waterfront, paying particular attention to houses where young women lived alone or with minimal supervision. He was careful to vary his routes and timing to avoid establishing any predictable pattern that might attract attention. Erik's first victim in Portland was a 22-year-old nursing student named Patricia Walsh, who lived in a small apartment near the harbor while completing her clinical training at Maine Medical Center. Patricia worked evening shifts at the hospital and often returned home alone well after midnight, walking through poorly lit streets that offered numerous opportunities for someone to approach her without being seen. Erik had been watching Patricia for several weeks, learning her schedule and identifying the route she took between the hospital and her apartment. He knew that she worked Tuesday through Saturday nights, and that she typically arrived home between 12:30 and 1 o'clock in the morning. He also observed that she carried a large nursing bag and often appeared tired after her long shifts, factors that would make her less alert to potential danger. On the night of October 28, 1975, Erik waited in the shadows near Patricia's apartment building, knowing that she would be returning from her shift within the hour. He had prepared carefully for the encounter, bringing rope and a knife that he concealed in a canvas bag, similar to the ones used by fishermen to carry their tools. His plan was to intercept Patricia in the narrow alley that served as a shortcut between the main street and her building's rear entrance. Patricia was walking more slowly than usual that night because she was carrying extra supplies from the hospital that she planned to use for a community health project. The additional weight made her less steady on her feet, and she was concentrating on maintaining her balance on the uneven pavement rather than watching for potential threats. Erik's approach was silent and swift, and Patricia had no opportunity to cry out or defend herself before she was overpowered. Erik had planned to take Patricia to a boat he knew would be unoccupied until the following morning, but his attack was interrupted by the unexpected appearance of a late-night delivery truck that turned into the alley just as he was attempting to subdue his victim. The driver's headlights illuminated the struggle, and Erik was forced to flee on foot, leaving Patricia injured but alive in the alley. Patricia survived the attack, but was severely traumatized and unable to provide a clear description of her assailant. She remembered only that he was tall, strong, and spoke with what might have been a foreign accent, but the encounter had been too brief and frightening for her to notice specific details about his appearance. Police launched an investigation, but had little evidence to work with beyond Patricia's fragmentary recollections. Erik realized that his attempt on Patricia had been too risky and that he needed to modify his methods to avoid detection. He began targeting women who lived in more isolated locations and who had less predictable schedules that would make their disappearances less likely to be discovered quickly. His next victim was Maria Santos, a 19-year-old who worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in Portland's most exclusive neighborhoods. Maria lived in a converted garage apartment on the outskirts of town, a location chosen because the rent was affordable, but which also placed her far from neighbors who might hear sounds of distress. She worked irregular hours for multiple employers and often returned home at different times, depending on her clients' needs. Eric had been watching her for weeks and had determined that her isolation and unpredictable schedule made her an ideal target. On the night of November 15th, Eric approached Maria's apartment while she was preparing for bed after a long day of cleaning houses. He had observed her routine and knew that she typically took a bath before going to sleep, a time when she would be particularly vulnerable and unlikely to hear someone approaching her door. He had also noted that her apartment had poor lighting and no telephone, factors that would prevent her from summoning help if she were attacked. Maria disappeared completely that night, and her absence wasn't discovered until 3 days later when one of her employers called to inquire why she had failed to appear for work. Police found her apartment undisturbed, with no signs of struggle or forced entry, suggesting that she had either left voluntarily or had been taken by someone she trusted enough to admit to her home. The investigation into Maria's disappearance revealed that she had mentioned being followed by a strange man to several of her employers, but she had not provided detailed descriptions and had seemed more puzzled than frightened by the attention. One employer remembered Maria saying that the man appeared to be a fisherman based on his clothing and the smell of the ocean that she had noticed when he passed close to her on the street. This detail prompted police to begin investigating members of Portland's fishing fleet, but the process was complicated by the transient nature of many fishing crews and the reluctance of fishermen to cooperate with law enforcement. Many crew members were working under assumed names or had irregular immigration status, making background checks difficult or impossible. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators learned that Eric Lindqvist had failed to report for work on the day after Maria's disappearance and had not been seen since that time. His fellow crew members reported that he had seemed agitated and distracted during his last few shifts, and that he had asked unusual questions about boat schedules and departure times. A search of Eric's rented room revealed evidence linking him to both Maria's disappearance and the attack on Patricia Walsh. Police found items of women's clothing that matched descriptions provided by the victims' families, as well as detailed maps of Portland neighborhoods, with certain streets and buildings marked in ways that suggested surveillance activities. Most disturbing was the discovery of a journal written in what appeared to be Norwegian, containing detailed descriptions of stalking activities and plans for future attacks. When translated, the journal revealed that Eric had been conducting a systematic campaign of surveillance against multiple women in Portland and had been planning a series of kidnappings that would have terrorized the entire city. Eric Lindqvist had vanished as completely as if he had been swallowed by the ocean he knew so well. Maritime authorities checked shipping records and found that several vessels had left Portland Harbor during the period when Eric disappeared, but none of the captains admitted to carrying unauthorized passengers. Some investigators believed Eric had stowed away on a departing ship, while others suspected he had stolen or borrowed a small boat and attempted to reach another coastal city. Despite an intensive search that extended to fishing ports throughout New England and the maritime provinces of Canada, Eric Lindqvist was never found. The case remained active for several years, but leads grew cold, and the investigation was eventually scaled back to routine monitoring of similar crimes in other coastal communities. The Lindqvist case had a profound impact on Portland's fishing industry, where boat owners and crew members found themselves subject to increased scrutiny from law enforcement and suspicious treatment from the general public. The city's previously welcoming attitude toward foreign fishermen was replaced by wariness and demands for more thorough background checks on all maritime workers. These 4 cases demonstrate how quickly the American dream could transform into a nightmare when predators disguised themselves as hopeful immigrants seeking better lives. Each of these men used the trust and goodwill of their new communities as weapons, exploiting the very openness and acceptance that made America a beacon for those fleeing poverty and persecution in their homelands. The cases also reveal how ill-equipped American law enforcement was to deal with criminals who had international backgrounds and the ability to disappear across borders or assume new identities. The lack of comprehensive background check systems and international cooperation made it possible for dangerous individuals to reinvent themselves completely, leaving their past crimes behind as they moved from place to place. Perhaps most troubling is the lasting impact these cases had on American attitudes toward immigration and newcomers. Each brutal crime contributed to a growing sense that foreign-born residents might pose threats that traditional Americans were unprepared to recognize or defend against. The fear and suspicion generated by these cases would influence immigration policy and community attitudes for decades to come. The victims of these crimes were not just the individuals who lost their lives, but entire communities that lost their innocence and their faith in the fundamental goodness of those seeking refuge in America. The Carmichael family, Rosa Delgado, Janet Morrison and David Chen, Patricia Walsh and Maria Santos became unwilling symbols of vulnerability in an increasingly dangerous world, their stories serving as cautionary tales about the price of trust in an age of uncertainty. Today, law enforcement agencies have far more sophisticated tools for investigating crimes involving international suspects, and background check systems have been improved to identify potential threats before they can harm innocent people. Yet the fundamental challenge remains the same: how to maintain America's tradition of welcoming newcomers while protecting citizens from those who would exploit that openness for sinister purposes. The cases we have examined today remind us that evil can wear many faces and speak many languages, that it can arrive on our shores disguised as hope and opportunity, and that the price of freedom and openness is eternal vigilance against those who would use our virtues as weapons against us. The American dream endures, but it must always be defended against those who would transform it into a nightmare for the innocent and the vulnerable. Thank you for joining me today as we explored these dark chapters in American criminal history. I hope you found this examination both informative and thought-provoking. Please share your thoughts and feedback, and I look forward to bringing you more compelling cases in the future.